So, you know that moment when you just finally close the door after a social event and your entire system sort of, I don't know, it lets go, it collapses. For me, that sort of social exhaustion feels so wildly out of proportion to what I actually just did. The whole duration of that social whatever, it feels like I'm constantly feeding some kind of parking meter with quarters to do the social whatevers, to like fit in with whatever is going on in that space. And I don't even notice, say, that I'm like that I have the jaw tension, or maybe I'm breathing differently or just functioning differently than I normally function at home. It's all really expensive, right? That's a lot of quarters. Actually, that analogy might not work for 2026. I guess we all use our phones at those things now. But anyways, most conversations about social masking, that's what this is, focus on the psychology of it, like the identity confusion and the loneliness. It really is very expensive in those ways. But there's a whole other thing that's also happening, like in our body. That's that clenched, tense jaw things. And that's what we're going to talk about today. This one means a lot to me because it's been a part of my life for as long as I can personally remember. Now, in kindergarten, a long time ago, I would come home and throw my lunchbox across the room and melt down or shut down. And this is the same kind of social exhaustion of trying to fit in at school, a new thing for me, all day long. But just a couple of months ago, now this is over 40 years later from those kindergarten classes, I took a course that just flat out asked us to mask socially as part of it. There's a whole video that was part of the Polyvagal Institute's course itself asking us to be a certain way socially in the Zoom room. And it was a very neurotypical, holistic way. So that class left me with like a delayed and fairly significant jaw pain at that social masking attempt to hide the distress and the discomfort from my teachers as per their request. And then I just gave up on masking and turned my camera off against their own social rules. At least now I know what's going on. I'm mature, I hope, and can adjust for that kind of thing. I can set my priorities and choose and better determine what rules make no sense or what rules are harmful and should be broken when I have the privilege of doing so. Now, I know better. I can make choices and sometimes adjustments. It still takes way too long in life to figure out these things, and that is why I'm making these episodes. So starting this week, I'm going to do the whole weekly episode thing all in one go. First, I'm going to start with what social masking actually does to the nervous system. The markers that are going to show up in the body, in our bodies, once it's been running too long. And I'm going to cover what happens in different types of neurodivergent bodies because we are different in that regard. And then I'm going to go over what actually helps at the body level, because most of the standard advice aims, well, somewhere else. Not very helpful for a lot of our types of brains. Quick note on terms before I get into this thing. Masking, social masking, and camouflaging all are the same thing in the context of this video. And I will mostly say social masking or just masking through the rest of this. So when we socially mask, our autonomic nervous system runs a sustained kind of performance socially. We're monitoring the room that we're in for social cues. We might be able to see them, but not necessarily understand them. We're adjusting our facial expressions and our tone of our voice and our posture and our timing. And we might be suppressing impulses so we can replace those impulses with the socially expected response delivered the socially accepted way. And the socially accepted way being a social system that is not like ours, even though ours is fully valid. Anyways, each of those adjustments asks our nervous systems to stay in a state of like heightened activation. And the sympathetic nervous system, the branch that's responsible for alertness and action, tends to stay turned up. So the volume is really high for us. Now, the research on autistic camouflaging or social masking confirms what a lot of us probably already know from the inside in our brains or our bodies. So a study from 2017 found that the stigma avoidance and the need to just kind of socially pass, that's what drives masking in environments that were not built for our neurotype, our very valid neurotype. It was built for another type. So more research a couple of years later found that the same motivations showing up over and over and over again, like things like safety and employment and relationships and avoiding kind of bullying and exclusion that happens in our lives from the get-go. It started in kindergarten for me. That essentially makes masking a nervous system survival strategy. Something that our bodies learn to do to keep us safe, oftentimes from a very, very young age. And I'll put the studies that I've looked at in the description for you to check out on your own and apply to your lives and apply your own meaning to it. Anyways, the problem is that survival mode runs on like short bursts. It's kind of like a sprint, right? So this is like imagine a predator appears, like a bear out in the woods. We have bears here, and our system just kind of ramps up. And then the threat passes, and our system slowly comes back down. So social masking asks your nervous system to stay in that ramped up state for hours, maybe an entire workday or an entire social event. And they can be varying levels of stress for this, right? But it stays up. And sometimes this might be an entire relationship, maybe at home, and all of these things, again, at varying levels of intensity. And now there's no moment where the threat passes because the threat is the social environment that we're living in itself. So in the community resilience model, oftentimes called CRIM, this kind of sustained activation is pushing you out of what they call the resilient zone. And this is the range where your nervous system can just kind of handle what's happening and recover from it naturally. It might be up, it might be down. It goes up and down in the system, but you can manage it on a day-to-day basis. Now, social masking can hold you potentially, depending on how intense it is, above that zone in a chronic sympathetic activation. And you might not have recovery periods that your system needs to come back into some kind of balance. I'm also going to go over what's kind of difficult. There's a difficult piece in this. Common advice out there is just unmask, because this is very common in neurodivergent spaces, and it's offered with good intentions, though. But just like that phrase, just be yourself, that you might hear from somebody who's autistic or neurotypical, which you might actually take them up on, and then that friend says, well, no, not like that. Well, they don't probably literally say it, but they probably infer something like that. After a while, maybe they just leave and you never hear from them again. So the problem is that people socially mask for reasons, and those reasons are often about safety. They're important reasons. We mask to keep our jobs so we can keep a roof over our head and eat. We mask to hold on to relationships with family members who might not understand autism or ADHD, even though they should. We mask to avoid being seen as rude or incompetent, or to get through, say, something important like a doctor's appointment that we need without being dismissed medically, which if you're a woman or minority or genderqueer or otherwise marginalized, this carries an even higher risk of happening in those moments. So it's important to understand that racialized folks often also carry code switching on top of the mask, and that can push the cost and the necessity even higher. So telling someone to unmask without addressing the environment and context that often demands the mask puts all of the responsibility onto the individual. The system demands this kind of performance, and then the individual gets told that they should stop performing at a great risk to themselves for something that they need, like the money or the medical advice or medical treatments. So this happens in smaller systems as well. like friendships. You might say mask early in a friendship in these lower stakes situations. And then when you feel comfortable enough, you might be feeling that it's a little bit safer, that you've explained yourself, that they understand that you're autistic and what autism is, but then the friendship still disappears. That person, maybe they stop returning calls or texts or whatever, and then they do that kind of slow fade thing. So even when the stakes and situations are a little bit lower, it can still be very harmful. It can be distressing. It can be hard to solve for as well. It can happen even when you have the best communication that you can do and the clearest sense of being understood, and then you discover that you weren't after all. So looking at a situation where masking is often necessary, at least in some contexts, and the cost can still be a lot. It can still be this cumulative stress thing, but sometimes it can be quite hard to see that cumulative stress thing. So there's an important thing that I touched on a moment ago that I want to emphasize before we go further in this. For some people, masking is also a safety strategy against racism, transphobia, or a very unsafe workplace or home, or just a workplace in general. And many people of color carry code switching that I mentioned earlier on top of this. And this can be a significantly increased load on both the mind and the body. And it also makes the mask more costly because it can even be dangerous to drop that mask. And I want to acknowledge that the whole problem that social masking is a thing in the first place is because of the social structure built around us, and that social structure is not inclusive of our way of communicating and socializing, which is just as valid and effective as allistic or neurotypical forms of socializing and communicating with each other. We're each just as good at communicating within our neurotypes. We only do masking because of their refusal to learn or accept or include us in our communication, even after we explicitly communicate this reality of these differences. So the solution is for the world to include us. But until that happens, we need to take into account the harmful cost it can have on our bodies and try to reduce that harm as much as possible. So this cost of social masking you don't get over it just going to sleep, getting a good night's sleep or something like that. I sure wish it did, although getting a good night's sleep is difficult for a lot of us too. So please don't tell, if you have an autistic friend, don't tell your autistic friend to just go take a nap, or just, why don't you go outside? Have you ever considered taking a little bit more yoga? Don't say that. Every day of sustained masking, social masking, it adds to what researchers call allostatic load, the cumulative wear on your body from chronic stress. And last week's episode did get into more of this. So allostasis is your body's process of adapting to demands. And allostatic load is what builds up when those demands don't let go. They don't let up in our lives, and our body can't fully recover between these things. So the systems involved in your stress response, hormonal and immune and metabolic and cardiovascular, they start to show some strain. It's quite unhealthy on our bodies. Now, it's reasonable to consider that social camouflaging or social masking can function as a form of chronic stress that contributes to allostatic load in autistic people. And if there's enough of that stress over time, that autistic burnout could be the result of that same kind of overload, the sustained nervous system demand without enough recovery in between these demands over time. So the more informal language that you might run across in autistic communities for this is called masking debt. And there are other terms, but that's one that I've seen. You might find this, say, in places on Reddit or social media and that sort of thing. Now, it's a useful term. It's good. That's why I liked it when I saw it, because it captures how this cost sort of compounds or adds up over time. So like, say you have a week of really heavy masking. Say you go out on a trip, like a road trip or something with somebody that you don't know too well. It doesn't mean that you have a week of recovery and you're suddenly better. It can cost a lot more time because our systems are trying to recover from this accumulated stress that just happened. And when the debt gets really high enough, like this is compounded over time, you maybe at work, you have a new boss or something like that, our nervous system often shifts out of the sustained sympathetic activation, that anxious, hyper-vigilant state of performing for that new boss, say, and then you get perhaps a shutdown response. And in polyvagal informed spaces, you might hear this referred to as a dorsal vagal state. And now I want to add a very important point here that scientists have contested this, like the neuroanatomy behind this label. And I'll link that in the description. And also that the polyvagal theory can be a very harmful theory for neurodivergent brains. It's not neuroinclusive at all. Anyways, what we generally recognize is the collapse state. And this might be something like, I can't talk to anybody, I can't do anything, and you might not even know why that's happening. This is an experience that a lot of us refer to as autistic burnout. Now, there isn't specific science around how allostatic load applies to things like social masking or autistic burnout, things like that, although there does seem to be a connection between masking and overload and burnout that lines up with what a lot of autistic people report to from their lived experiences. One of the frustrating things about masking cost is that it's hard to notice while it's happening. We've been doing masking, say, for years, maybe even decades, and the people who are often good at it don't even realize that they're doing it at all. The signals that our bodies send us often get filed in our brains somewhere under like, oh, this is normal, because we've maybe never known anything different, or we've been doing it so long we don't remember doing anything different. Like many people like myself have low interoception too, so we don't feel these signals directly. Or we might have alexithymia as well, where it's hard to label or understand our emotions, especially in the moment. So if this is true for you, like it is for me, it makes signals or noticing even more challenging to do. Recent research also suggests that this social masking might become automatic quite early in life. But even if cues are different or limited or something else, often our bodies still kind of know somehow. And the somatic markers of masking cost are often a little bit more specific than something just like I feel exhausted, or noticing a shift in our bodies, or a sigh or a yawn or something when we arrive at home, or that you're rubbing your jaw. Maybe somebody else notices something about how you're holding your body or something. But if any of these things show up consistently for you after being out somewhere social and maybe doing that social mask, your nervous system might be telling you something, or might be trying to tell you something. Jaw tension or teeth clenching is often something people talk about in relation to masking. You might not notice that you're doing this during the day, or you might notice maybe not during the Zoom meeting that you went to, but afterwards that your jaw is aching, maybe in the evening. Or maybe you even went to the dentist and they're saying like, oh, you're grinding your teeth. That's another one. This sustained social monitoring, social pressure oftentimes comes out in our muscles, our mouth, our teeth grinding, or our face, because we're doing this constant work to manage ourselves while we mask. So shallow breathing or holding your breath, these are other things that you might notice. You might catch yourself doing this when you say you get home or sort of take a break, you go outside. You might have been restricting your breathing while you were socially masking, and your nervous system prioritizes the social performance. So when it's over, you might notice a shift. Another really common one is digestive disruption. So things like clenching like your stomach, or feeling nauseous, or losing your appetite during social events. And these gut issues might suddenly appear after you've been masking for longer periods of time. But you might not notice anything until you notice the pattern after, say, a bunch of long days out. Now, this happens because our guts have a very extensive network of nerves, and it responds to sustained sympathetic activation of our nervous systems. So digestive issues are very common amongst neurodivergent people like us, and this is one of the reasons. So post-social collapse, this might be something that you experience as well. So you're coming home, say, after an event or a work day where you've been socially masking, and maybe when you get home, you're just unable to do anything for a very long time. Or maybe you notice that you use your weekends to kind of just prepare for another week ahead of all this social masking. And while work is oftentimes hard for neurotypical humans as well, of course, this kind of collapse that we experience after work probably feels disproportionate to whatever just happened. I mean, this might be summed up with something like, we just try to simply exist, or just simply fit in, or not be perceived. Sensory sensitivity might be something that you experience at amplified amounts after social masking for a long time, or just really anything that just eats away at your overall capacity over a period of time. So you might be able, for example, to just manage sounds while you're at work. But once you make it home, those same sounds are just too much. And that's because you've drained that battery down. Your system has spent its time processing bandwidth on social performance. And then once you get home, there's just simply less remaining to just filter or handle those sensory inputs. So this social collapse thing is a big one for me. On a good day, for me, this might just mean taking a nap, even though I just don't enjoy naps. They wreck me for the rest of the day. But on a bad day, say when something really stressful happened socially, like being misunderstood is a big one for me, or if some assumption was made, this can kind of lead to a full-blown meltdown. So you have the fatigue from that experience of being misunderstood, and then you have the rest of it drained, and then that just tips the social masking thing into a meltdown. So one thing on all of these markers, none of them mean the same thing for every person. So I'm not handing you like a checklist where, say, your tight jaw means some sort of state, some sort of fixed state. Like the jaw, the breath, the gut, the collapse. These are all some of the more common things that people are reporting. But you're the one who knows what your own version of this is going to look like. Like if a body sensation is difficult to read, you can watch for the same pattern in other places in your life, like the speed of your thoughts, or how loud it feels inside, or how much focus maybe you've got left, or what your energy happens to be doing. Some people clock this maybe on their smartwatch before they feel it at all. The point is that you want to notice the cost while it's still building up in whatever way you can actually access that thing. So if the cost of masking shows up in your body, maybe it might be showing up as jaw tension, or you might be breathing a little bit differently, or you might feel like you're clenching your gut, or you might feel like when you get home, right, and you close the door and you're finally not in that social masking environment. So there's a lot of tools that might help to have around, and a lot of them tend to work on this body level. Now, the usual advice for masking is some sort of version of give yourself permission to rest. And that can be part of it. But the trouble is that it's a cognitive strategy. It doesn't always reach the nervous system, that load that you're carrying directly. So telling yourself that you're allowed to rest doesn't always lower the sympathetic activation that's already, say, in your body somewhere, like in your jaw or in your breath. And sometimes that advice isn't even all that clear or actionable. Like I've seen it, but I'm like, well, how do I actually implement, right? Like you're allowed to rest, okay. But what do you actually do with your body if you're still kind of running that performance type thing, like later on after the performance has actually ended, right? So the tools I'm going to go into here work at the body level where that sort of thing actually is existing. So 2 CRIM skills that are useful here are tracking and resourcing. And now a quick note before I get into these things. CRIM doesn't frame these things as masking specific tools. This is something that I've been working on with these tools myself. These are adjustments that I've personally made, and your experience can vary. Now, I've personally made these changes to make them more inclusive for neurodivergent brains because the model itself is not that neuro-inclusive for some of us. So I also want to note, you know your body better than I do. So take what fits and leave what doesn't. So CRIM tracking is the practice of noticing a physical sensation inside your body or, importantly, for some of us, outside of it. And then we note whether that sensation is pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. So if you notice something unpleasant, you can choose to shift your attention to something else at any time. So you might notice, oh, my jaw feels pretty tight, or you might notice that the light from the window is pleasant. So you're just noticing whether a sensation is one that you like or you dislike or you feel just kind of neutral about. So there's no step here where you're naming an emotion or working out what the sensation means. And you can always use ones that you can access, whether or not they're internal or external. So that's what makes it usable for the markers that I went through a minute ago, right? Like, so the tight jaw and the held breath are both sensations that you can potentially track. You don't have to figure out what they mean. You don't have to label them. You can just notice what ones are unpleasant and you can shift those towards something that's neutral or pleasant and just kind of stay there instead. And that shift is part of the regulation. Now, if inner body sensation is hard to read, it absolutely is for me, the thing that you can track can be something outside of you, which we can often access a lot easier. So this might be the feeling of your feet on the floor. It might be a sound that you like, or it might be the light from the window or something that you visually see. And CRIM counts those too, right? You can work with them as part of this model. So CRIM resourcing is bringing to mind something that creates a sense of calm or strength. This might be a person, a place, a memory. It could be your pet. It might be an activity that you did in the past or something that you generally enjoy. It could be a passion of yours. And then you can notice what happens in your body or when you hold it in your mind if you can't access those bodily sensations. So you might be able to notice potentially, does tension ease? You might be noticing something that shifts when you bring that to mind. For a lot of neurodivergent people, passions that we have are some of the most effective resources that we can draw on because they're generally regulating for us. So thinking about that passion can produce a real shift in our bodily state. And that shift is something that you can choose to pay attention to and use. So tracking and resourcing give you real-time information in the moment about what your body is doing or what your mind is doing or what you're noticing. And that information can give you something to act on. So maybe you notice the jaw tension partway through a Zoom call. I have to do this intentionally because I don't notice it unless I do. And you might choose to go camera off for a stretch if you're able to. Or maybe another time you might resource with a passion after you have, like, say, a tense conversation at a family dinner or something, and then your system can settle enough to get through the rest of the evening without collapsing, perhaps. So these tools won't get rid of the cost of social masking. It's not fixing social masking, which is a problem. It is an issue. The environment that demands this mask in the first place is still the actual problem. And that's bigger than any of our individual practices are going to solve for, right? What these tools can do is let you notice the cost while it's happening, maybe before it builds into a full collapse, and then give you maybe just a small move or something that you can do in the moment. So one note here before I wrap up, the Trauma Resource Institute that developed CRIM this is a set of low-risk wellness skills for community-level sharing. They're useful. I find them quite useful. They're low-risk self-care. They don't replace professional support if you're dealing with burnout or trauma or anything else that's more serious. So understanding the biology of all of this is just one thing that you can do. Building a personal practice, that part is really individual and it takes time. So you're learning which sensation gives you what kind of, say, warning, and then which resource actually changes things for you, might change that state that you're experiencing. This is all very specific to each of us. And so figuring out how many of these things fits into your masking days, like what is a heavy masking thing for you, that part gets easier over time, especially if, say, someone else can kind of help you with that process. Not always available, but sometimes it is. So this is the question that I like to ask myself. The next time that I'm kind of looking at that post-social collapse, maybe it's coming, maybe the pattern is logically there. I know this thing is about to happen. It's probably going to lead to collapse for me. I like to think about what I'm going to change. Maybe something I can build around that. It can help me prepare, or it can help me do some kind of preventative measure or watch for something in the moment. What will that look like for you? So I know that working on this for me is like doing manual jaw tension checks. That gives me a signal. Trying to check in more because it's really hard for me to notice these things in the moment. So I'm curious what this might be for you. What are your thoughts on this? And what do you already do? And what could you maybe see yourself adding to that? So that's it for this one. This is Wired Divergent, and I'm Jen deHaan. I'm working with neurodivergent adults who want to build a regulation practice that fits their own nervous system. And I'm taking practice coaching clients at a very low rate right now while I work through to full certification. So if you think that might be useful for you, the coaching details and the booking link are in the description. There's also a newsletter and written versions of these episodes and other resources over at my website at jendehaan.com. The link's also in the description. If you want a guided version of the CRIM tracking check-in for exactly this masking pattern, you can run during a heavy day. You can do that. There's one on the podcast feed along with these educational episodes. And if you're listening to the podcast, all of this is on YouTube as a video. Bye for now.